Hello and welcome to How to Do Things with Words. I'm sorry to be getting this video to you a little late this week. I hope you've already been able to start the readings on slurs and that you've made some progress there. Of course, you have your homework due this evening, and I think that you'll have done some work on that already. This week we're talking about slurs. We're applying the theory, once again, that we've developed over the first course of the term, the first 6 weeks, our kind of general theory of pragmatics, to discuss slurring words. So the concept of slur words. So these are words that speakers use to demean and denigrate particular groups of people. So obviously this topic is a sensitive one. And I wanted to start today just by going over some discussion parameters, because we will obviously be discussing this tomorrow on Wednesday and then again on Friday. So I think the most important thing when we're considering these sensitive topics is, first of all, that we all need to resolve to treat others with respect and to handle this topic with the proper sensitivity it requires. We are all of us subject to different slur words, but some of those slur words are associated with particularly pernicious and damaging histories that make them much, much more painful when they're heard than other of the words. So we need to be mindful of that and to be careful in this conversation. First of all, never to denigrate anyone by means of these words, but also perhaps to exercise some caution, when it comes to our own use of these words. And I'll just say a few things about how I'm planning to go in this discussion. So first of all, I want to point out additionally that there is a kind of balance that we need to strike here. So what we're doing when we in this section of the class on slurs is theorizing about how slurs function. And when we theorize about how slurs function, we need to be attentive to these negative aspects of these words. We need to be attentive to their demeaning and offensive character. But at the same time, we need to be careful not to demean and offend others through what we say or what we mention. So I'm appealing here to a distinction between saying something and mentioning something. It will certainly never be appropriate to use these words or to say these words ourselves in this class, but instead what we might end up doing is mentioning some of these words or mentioning some of their analogs, right? Like the B word or the K word or some other abbreviations like that. So at most, we're going to be mentioning these words, referring to how other people use them, but not using them ourselves, certainly not using them to denigrate anyone. But we still need to be mindful, because it is an important aspect of how these words function. We need to be mindful of the negative aspects of these words, their demeaning and offensive characters. And then just as a rule of thumb, in our discussions, when I need to use or mention slurs, I will try to primarily use or mention slurs that apply to my identity group. But in discussing examples from the papers, I may have to stray from this practice sometimes. Obviously, these papers use or discuss a number of very offensive words. I will not be using those words myself. I won't even be mentioning those words. I will instead use the kind of non-offensive analogs that I was just discussing. So that's my plan going forward here. So our main question today, and for this component of the class, is why and how do slurs offend? This handout, I updated some of it for our class, but I forgot to change the date. So this has recently been updated. You know, 02, let's just change that, 2021. But this handout is actually focused on a much more in-depth reading by Anderson and Lepore. They are the authors of, excuse me, of the work that you looked at this week. What Did You Call Me? Slurs as Prohibited Words. Lavelle Anderson is a really young and really influential scholar on this topic and on negotiated discussion across difference. Really, really interesting philosopher. And then Ernie Lepore is a older philosopher working in the philosophy of language at Rutgers. They've written 2 papers together on this topic. And the one that this handout is based on is the one that's a little bit more in depth, a little bit longer. I'm going to put it up as an optional reading so you can look at it if you're interested. But I think this handout gives you a nice idea of what some of the positions in conceptual space are. And we're going to talk through those positions. And I think that'll be a good ground for understanding where Anderson and Lepore are coming from, and also where Bollinger is coming from in her article. So this other article, Slurring Words, again, will be available as an optional reading for you on Moodle. So essentially, there are several different strategies that people might adopt when it comes to the slur literature. Um, One of these, so some of these views are what we might describe as content strategies, okay? So what do content strategies have in common? Well, content strategies suggest that slurs have offensive meanings, that the words themselves express negative ideas about their targets. So the main idea is that there is some kind of contentful component, some aspect of meaning that slurs are able to produce or to express, and that is what the offensiveness of a slur connects to. So if that's the case, then slurs are similar to pejoratives, seeing words like stupid, um, then though they differ from pejoratives in being targeted at specific groups. Right, so again, these views are called content strategies because they say slurs express negative content or ideas about their target. And there are a variety of these different content strategies that Anderson and Lepore discuss in the longer article and that come up in the shorter article that you're looking at for this week. So the first one of these views that we might talk about, and I think this really builds off of our kind of account of pragmatics and meaning in language that we've developed up to this point, is just the idea that slurs express slurs demean and offend because of something that is expressed in the semantic meaning of the word, right? So slurs just have as part of their meaning these kind of offensive ideas. And when a slur goes to compose a sentence, and those offensive ideas are carried over into the content meaning of the sentence itself. So those offensive ideas in some way contribute maybe to the propositional content, the primary propositional content that is expressed by the sentence containing the slur. So you might think of this position as one that like a semantic minimalist would embrace about slurs. They might say, well, look, slurs are offensive because their meaning contains these offensive components, these offensive ideas. So when we think about this, view that says that slurs are offensive because of their semantic content, we need to be careful to distinguish an extensional view of concept meaning from what we might describe as an intentional view. So up to this point, when I've talked about the meanings of words, I've typically talked about them extensionally. So I've said, a word picks out a particular class out there in the world. There are other ways, though, of conceiving of the way in which words function. So philosophers, since at least this article, since in reference by Gottlob Frege, published in 1892, these philosophers have argued that there's actually another component aside from the extensional component that contributes to word meanings. So one simple example Frege uses is the idea of the morning star versus the evening star. So these were common nautical terms that people had for centuries to refer to the first star you see, the last star you see in the morning after the sun has come up, and the first star you see at night after the sun has gone down. I think in both cases, it turned out that that what was being referred to here was the same heavenly body, and it wasn't even a star. It was the planet Venus reflecting light from the sun. But these words, even though they picked out the same thing, even though they had the same reference, they had distinct connotative meaning, right? They connoted different things, right? The morning star picked out Venus, the evening star picked out Venus, but they each carried these different ideas with them. One carried the idea of the last star you see in the morning, and the other carried the idea of the first star that you see in the evening, okay? Even though they were the same body, even though they have the same extension, those words, They have different intentions. They somehow mean or carry different ideas with them. So the basic idea behind the semantic view is that slurs function in this way. So for any slur, there is a non-offensive counterpart that we can point to. Proponents of this theory might point out, right? So, you know, for a word like, and I will use a slur here, but it's a slur that is, I think, pretty atypical for us. It's used in the article. Like a slur like the word boon in Australian, or a slur like the word boon carries with it the same reference that the word Australian Aboriginal carries with it. Okay, so these two words pick out the same reference class of individuals, but one of these words has associated with it these additional intentional ideas, expresses these additional ideas that the other doesn't. So Australian Aboriginal is this non-offensive word for referring to this group of individuals, but boon carries with it some deeply offensive content. So it conveys the idea of a dysfunctional person, among other things. Also the idea of a better off being killed. These are very negative ideas associated with this. And the semantic view is going to say that that word functions by actually expressing those ideas, even though it only picks out the same group as this non-offensive term, Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal. Now, Lepore and Anderson and Lepore in their longer article raise some very good objections to this view. So here's one objection. So one objection to the semantic view is that it is to consider offense under denial. Okay, so we might consider the word John is stupid. So if I say John is stupid, that's not a slur word because it doesn't pick out a group of individuals, but it is offensive to John. Okay, it is an offensive word. And now what we find is that if we negate that word, if we say John is not stupid, then we find that that offense goes away. So in the case of these kind of pejorative terms, which are still negative terms, but are not slur words, right? If I negate the thing, then the offense goes away. So John is stupid, may be offensive to John. John is not stupid is not offensive to John, right? So a denial of that thing makes the offense go away. But notice with slurs, that is not the case, right? Here's an example. Ben Amin is a K word, okay? This would be very offensive, right? But additionally, if I say Ben Amin is not a K word, and if I were actually using the word here, that would still be as offensive as saying that he is a K word, right? So it seems like under denial, the offensiveness doesn't go away, but typically these kinds of effects, if they are housed in the semantic component of the word, those effects will go away under negation. So that in some way suggests that the semantic view is not the correct one. I think, you know, we've used this negation test to think about like whether something is a presupposition, for example. So maybe this test points in favor of a kind of presuppositional view of the content housed, the offensive content housed in the slur word. But we'll look at that view in just a second. There are other reasons for thinking this test doesn't work. These are covered on the handout. I'm just going to skip down to the third one and say, well, it doesn't seem like it's content that is really doing the work, because if we can sort of lay out those ideas as clearly as possible, Anderson and Lepore have the intuition, it's still not as offensive as using the slur. So go into as much depth about the ideas expressed by this thing as you can. This is idea 3 or C here. And still, it's not going to be as offensive as just saying the slur word, right? So I might say that person, as opposed to saying that person's a boon, I might say that person is a dysfunctional Aboriginal who is better off dead. And I might lay that out specifically, but still it doesn't seem as offensive as using the slur word, which suggests it's not really these ideas, these connotations that are being carried along with the word that are doing the work. Okay, so on these considerations, Anderson and Lepore reject the semantic content view of the offensiveness of slurs. They consider next a presupposition view, okay? So we've talked about presuppositions here before. There are ways in which presuppositions are triggered in different ways. This discusses some. Right, so if I say Julius is a bachelor, then that entails that Julius is an unmarried man, right? If I say I have written to every headmaster in Rochdale, that carries the presupposition that there are headmasters there. There are various different ways in which presuppositions are triggered by utterances. And the presupposition view holds that, for example, an offensive word like boon, unlike the word Australian Aboriginal, is a presupposition trigger which presupposes that, for example, Australian Aboriginals are dysfunctional people, okay? So the idea here is not that it's part of the semantic content, and for that reason, it makes sense why, because it's a presupposition, it makes sense maybe why the offensiveness would survive negation, because we know that presuppositions are carried even if we negate the sentences they occur in. So this might give us some initial reason to think the presupposition view is correct. However, there are certain other tests that suggest that that the presupposition view is inaccurate. So one thing is that presuppositions do not typically survive embedding under say. So embedding under a kind of intentional context where it's actually being attributed to someone else. So a kind of famous example of a presupposition that philosophers have pointed to is the example of John stopped beating his wife, which presupposes that John beat his wife in the past, okay? It doesn't explicitly say that, but it presupposes it. However, if we embed that under a said statement, right? So if we said, Frank said that John stopped beating his wife, then we don't get the same intuition there, right? Consider if I said, John stopped beating his wife even though he never did, that seems like a contradiction. But if I say, Frank said that John stopped beating, sorry, did I say, I meant to say, John stopped beating his wife even though he never did. That seems like a contradiction. It seems like I'm contradicting myself, which suggests again that that is a presupposition of what I've said. But if I said that Frank said that John stopped beating his wife, but John has never beaten his wife, then that doesn't lead me to contradict myself. So embedding that same sentence under a said statement seems to make that presupposition go away in some way. But consider the next example of a slur. If someone says, Eric said that a B word ran for president in 2016, but women are not offensive or inferior on account of being women, right? So I would be denying maybe what could be the presuppositional content of B word, right? But here, even though I'm denying that thing, it's still offensive for me to use this word embedded under the say statement. At least that's what Anderson and Lepore think. We can talk about whether that's the case or not, but if that is accurate, it's some reason to think that the offensive content of a slur is not a presupposition. So that gives us some reason to reject the presupposition view. The next view is to think of these as conventional implicatures, right? So it could be that what the offensiveness of a slur attaches to something it implicates. Now, presumably here, it's going to be conventionally implicated and not conversationally implicated, because conversational implication, right, takes a proposition and our understanding of this information, including the maxims of conversation, to work out what is implied by that thing. But conventional implicatures attach to particular words. So maybe it's the case that the B word or the N word or the K word have these kind of conversational or conventional implicatures attached to them. Certainly the offensiveness seems to go away if we use the non-offensive analog. So that maybe suggests that the offensiveness is detachable in a certain way. But however, it seems to be that when that conventional operates conventionally, it's part of the lexical, though not semantic content of the word, but that it operates as it does in the above construction. So it operates that way regardless of who says it, right? So the thought here in this argument that Anderson and Lepore use against this kind of conventional implicature view is, like, conventional implicatures are conveyed no matter who's using the word, right? So if I use the word but in the following sentence, Mark is a philosopher, but his wife is smart, it's going to carry that implication no matter who says it, right? But is always going to carry this contrastive element attached to it no matter who says it. But Anderson and Lepore argue that slurs don't function this way. There are certain groups that can use slurs without expressing any offensive ideas, without offending anyone, right? Particularly in-group members are able to use these words non-offensively, Anderson and Lepore think. So that suggests maybe that the slurring content is not expressed by a conventional implicature either. Okay, so in light of these objections, and I should have put, this is actually a little bit misconstrued here. I should have put here section, well, okay, so these two are like content strategies, I guess. And then conventional implicature is a little bit different because it's not attached to the content of the word. I mean, it is in a certain sense, but it's also this extra non-semantic component of meaning, right? We think of implicatures as being as operating after the semantic content, after the after what is said. Even if in the case of conventional implicatures, they're like an add-on onto the semantics. But then there's this third account, and this is the account that Anderson and Lepore really focus on. It's the one that their article that you're looking at discusses primarily. And so what is this view? So according to the view, Anderson and Lepore's view, slurs as prohibited words, it's not really something about meaning per se that makes it the case that a slur is offensive, right? So here's a telling quote from the other paper, the one you're not reading, that they use. No matter what its history, no matter what it means or communicates, no matter who introduces it, regardless of its past associations, once relevant individuals declare a word a slur, it becomes one, okay? So what Anderson and Lepore is suggesting is that slurs are words that have been prohibited by particular groups of people, particularly the group of people that is denigrated by the slur, and that is what makes them offensive. It makes them offensive right? Right, their solution divorces the offensiveness of slurs from their contents. Slurs are offensive because they are prohibited words. So in effect, you can think of it this way. This group of individuals has legislated this word is not to be used, and yet people are using it. So the thought is that that is actually denigrating the group by, in a sense, saying, you know, your prohibitions don't matter. We're using this word in any case, regardless of what you want, right? And that is in some way, that is the force of the offensiveness in some way. It would be as though someone were saying, don't do this thing. This is my place to decide whether or not this thing is done. And yet you just like ignore them, right? Like you just ignore their own prohibitions on matters that are relevant to them. You overlook those and react in the way that you would have wanted anyway. That is the thought behind Anderson and Lepore's view, right? This view also nicely explains how it is that slur words can be used by in-group members. Maybe the prohibition says, no out-group members use this word, but we could use this word, right? That's a viable prohibition that someone might put forward. And so that suggests why in-group members maybe can use a slur word that out-group members can't. An additional point, maybe in favor of this view, is that it also explains how a slur word can be reclaimed, right? So if you think about the word queer, for example, So queer was initially a slur word, an offensive slur word, but it has been reclaimed by the gay community. I mean, by the queer community at this point. I should just use the word again. That's the word that is used now, right? So the word queer has been reclaimed by the gay community, and what does that amount to? Well, essentially, it was offensive because there were a group of homosexuals who found that word offensive, um, and they made a prohibition on it. And so when people were using it then, it was offensive to that group of individuals. But now, through this kind of reclamation project, there has been that prohibition has been lifted, and they've said, no, we're going to reclaim this word. This word is the word we're taking to refer to ourselves, right? And so because of that, now suddenly this word can be used again in this meaningful way. Maybe initially only within the in-group, but eventually that reclamation project has totally reclaimed that word so that there are now, queer studies departments and universities around the country. So there's still a lot of open debate in this literature, and there are many other positions to consider. I will say the second reading that you have this week, the Bollinger piece, is similar in some ways to the Anderson and Lepore piece. So essentially what Bollinger suggests is that slurs essentially that slurs are essentially words that we could use instead of a neutral counterpart. We know that people draw offense from these words. So choosing to use the slur instead of the neutral counterpart in some way generates offense because a speaker has demonstrated that they prefer to use this offensive word rather than this unoffensive word to refer to this group. Okay, so the second view, Bollinger's view, really takes, I think, what Anderson and Lepore are doing and sort of embeds it in a way in a kind of implicative view of what we can infer about what a speaker means or about a speaker's feelings from the things that they say. And so it's a kind of interesting extension on Anderson and Lepore, and we can talk about how these two views are related to each other, how they differ, and other of your thoughts on slurring words on Wednesday and Friday. I'm looking forward to it. Bye.